afternoon. Welcome to our Facebook Live here at CGS News. I'm Sarah David. I will be hosting today's live. Vaccination centres throughout Wales have been working to full capacity over the last few weeks. Leisure centres and village halls have been transformed. But we know that there are still lots of questions surrounding COVID-19 vaccines. And today we are joined by two experts who can hopefully answer those questions for you. We are joined today by Dr. Benar Talabani, a member of Muslim Doctors Cymru, who have been very vocal on social media regarding misinformation around COVID-19 vaccines. And we are also joined by Dr. Peter Saul, a practicing GP in Wrexham and the joint chair of Royal College of General Practitioners in Wales. Now, don't forget, you are all welcome to ask any question to both our experts in the comment section on this Facebook Live. So thank you both very much for joining us today. This afternoon, Wales has become the first UK nation to vaccinate all of its top 4 priority groups. Dr. Saul, what's your reaction to this piece of good news?
I think it's really good news because it's vitally important we get as much of the population vaccinated as quickly as possible to stop the spread, to stop people getting ill, and the more people we vaccinate, the better we are going to be at stopping some of these alternative strains that are developing, these altered viruses. So it's really good news.
Yeah, and Dr. Talabani, it's a good sign, isn't it?
It's a wonderful sign, and actually I think we should be really proud that as people who live in Wales that this has been achieved. It's great that the top 4 groups have had their first vaccine, and this is going to be rolled out. And I think the vaccination programme and the success of it is just proves what can happen with the NHS. The NHS is a fantastic institution, and staff within the NHS should be so proud of themselves for having achieved this.
And we've also learnt over the last 24 hours that there are reductions in supply of COVID-19 vaccines in Wales. The Welsh Government have addressed this. They've said it was expected and there's no cause for concern. But Dr. Saul, can I ask, when were your GPs made aware of this reduction in supply?
Well, I've only been made aware this week, actually, the last couple of days. I think we probably knew it was coming because the vaccine manufacturers said that there was going to be a dip in supply. And if you recall, there was that row between AstraZeneca and the European Union, which was relating to supply issues. And also with Pfizer, they mentioned that. So it's going to be a temporary drop, and it's going to result in a reconfiguration of the factories so that we can actually get more in the long run. So it's to be expected, and we're managing it. One of the interesting things about vaccine is that it's not really like making cars or something like that, washing machines, because until you actually make the batch, you don't know how much of a product you're going to have. So it's almost more like cooking than manufacturing, because you're making these, if you like, cakes, and how many of them are going to be good cakes and how many of them are not going to be so good cakes. And that's been one of the issues that's been hitting supply up till now, in that we've not known exactly how much we're going to get because the vaccine manufacturers don't know how productive each of the batches has been. But as we get more production in place, it's going to smooth out that, so that we should be more predictable.
So do you think people should be concerned when they're hearing on the news that there's a reduction in supply?
No, I think this is a temporary thing, and we've got plenty of vaccine ordered, and well enough for everybody.
Well, you are both specialists on the front line of this vaccine rollout and indeed this pandemic. But are you both seeing any hesitancy from the public regarding getting their COVID-19 vaccine? Dr. Talabani, what kind of concerns have you seen from people?
Thank you. So I'm not a vaccinator, but across social media and across our specialty in kidney and transplant medicine, we have seen some hesitancy, and a lot of the themes are actually very common across all groups of patients, and it's questions regarding, whether vaccines develop too quickly, how do we know that side effects are not going to be long term, It really is questions regarding those things. And then there are the questions that are based on myths that I have seen circulate in social media, and a bit more far-fetched, if I may say so. But yes, I think I've come across some hesitation and some questions.
Yes, you're talking about misinformation and social media and maybe far-fetched pieces of information. What's maybe the most far-fetched myth or rumour you've heard about vaccines?
I think I don't know why, but Bill Gates keeps coming up over and over again, and I don't really understand why. He's nothing to do with these vaccines. I think all scientists and doctors can agree on this and know this. There's a myth that the vaccine is a microchip to track us, which is just utter nonsense. But I think it's important that when patients present us with these myths, with real concerns, that we don't just brush it aside, that we actually address it, and actually address those concerns and keep that dialogue open so they feel they can approach us and ask us these questions, because there's so much misinformation on social media. Our job is to arm everybody with accurate information so they can protect themselves.
Yes, and we'll certainly get back to some of those pieces of misinformation in a short while. But we've been collecting a lot of questions from our viewers over the last week. And one of the main areas of concern seems to be surrounding the speed that these vaccines were developed. And people are worried perhaps that there's a lack of knowledge around long-term immunity. So, Dr. Saul, what would you say to those people who are concerned about the lack of knowledge?
These vaccines have been tested as well as any other vaccine, really. What's happened is that normally speaking, the development of a vaccine takes 5 or even longer years, and it tends to be a linear sort of, you do this, then you do that, then you do the next thing. But because it's been seen as a crisis, and to be honest, governments have thrown money at this, a lot of these stages have been done in parallel. And for example, with the British regulation of the vaccines, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency has been involved right from the start and has been sort of evaluating each stage as it goes along, rather than waiting till the end and then doing the evaluation. So I would say, I'm very confident with these vaccines, certainly in terms of their safety. And I've been very fortunate to have had 2 doses of the vaccine, and I'd recommend that to anybody. It's not given me a worry at all.
Well, we've had one question here from Ellen Jones in Cardiff, who asks, if I've had COVID, do I still need the vaccine, or would I be safe with just the antibodies? Dr. Talabani, what would you say to Ellen in Cardiff?
It's a very good question, and thank you for your question. Yes, you do need the vaccine, because we've seen that if you've had COVID, some people develop short-term immunity to the virus, but we don't know about long-term immunity if you have had the virus. Whereas when it comes to the vaccines, we know that most people who have the vaccine develop very good short-term immunity and then long-term immunity after the second dose. So that's why even if you've had COVID, you should still have the vaccinations and both doses.
And we know that in the clinical trials, 3 weeks were left between both doses of the jab. But by now, of course, there's a 12-week gap between doses. And this question comes from Rishi in Llandav, who asks, do you feel the government is treating the UK population as guinea pigs in a clinical trial? In the UK, they have said 3 months between each dose is enough, but other countries have said 3 weeks. Dr. Saul, what would you say to Rishi?
I think it's a good question, Rishi. We've got two vaccines at the moment. We've got the AstraZeneca one, the Oxford vaccine, and we've got the Pfizer vaccine. They use slightly different technologies. The evidence for the AstraZeneca vaccine for having a second dose up to 12 weeks later is very good. We know that the first dose gives you good protection, and we know that having a booster at 12 weeks, in some respects, may actually be better than having it sooner. So that's not really in question, in my view. The other vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, this is the one where there was a recommended 21-day period between the first and the second dose. we know that the antibody levels after the first dose are pretty good by 2 or 3 weeks. And you're right, it is a sort of an experiment that what is happening, in that we haven't got all the trial data to support that. That data is being gathered. But the government and the medical authorities have been faced with a very difficult situation, in that do we do sort of an absolutely, if you like, perfect job with everybody from day one, or do we try and get as many people vaccinated with a pretty good effect of vaccine, so that we can actually protect more people? So that's the strategy. I think that if we had unlimited supplies of vaccine, we would be giving the Pfizer vaccine at 3 weeks, but we haven't, so we're having to make a compromise. Now, having said that, I'm certainly seeing people now 4 or 5 weeks after having their initial vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, getting invites for a second Pfizer vaccine. So we are trying, where the supplies allow it, to target those groups with a second vaccine as soon as we can. And the people with the AstraZeneca, we know that it's great to have it after 12 weeks, so that will probably carry on.
There's maybe also a bit of confusion about if people have had the vaccine, like you mentioned, do the rules maybe still apply to them? We've had one question through from Sandhya Karia from London, who asks, I've had the vaccine and so has my mother. Can I still visit her? Dr. Saul, do the rules still apply if you've had the vaccine?
Yeah, they do. They do. We need to be very careful, because one of the problems with the vaccine is if you have the vaccine, you can still carry the coronavirus. So although you're protected, you might not be able to protect other people. Now, again, we're getting more information about this. And I noticed that yesterday, the American authorities, the CDC, have taken a step, and they've said that if you've had 2 doses of the vaccines, you don't have to isolate if you've been in contact with a case. So I don't know if we've got any listeners from the States, but so that is them taking a step forward. Now, I suspect that doesn't apply to the UK, but I suspect that in due course we will get some guidance that will start saying similar things, that if you've had a full course of the vaccine, then some restrictions will be lessened. But at the moment, you must, whether or not you've had the vaccine, you have to all behave. Everyone has to behave in the same way. Wash your hands, wear face coverings, social distancing, bubbles.
Yes, well, if you are just joining us, welcome. We're here live at CGS News with Dr. Benar Talabani and Dr. Peter Saul, asking them your questions about COVID-19 vaccines. So please keep your questions coming. We are monitoring them all. Now, we've had a number of questions this week surrounding the new strains of COVID-19. Dr. Talabani, can I just ask, how effective are these vaccines against new strains of coronavirus?
So the data that we have essentially suggests that all the vaccines that are approved in the UK will give very good protection against severe disease, against all the strains. Where there is some question is whether we will have protection in mild to moderate disease. So the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine did a small study where the average age of participants was about 31, and they showed that actually it doesn't provide very good protection against mild moderate disease. However, the Johnson vaccine, which isn't yet approved in the UK, but we have data on, is actually a very, very similar vaccine platform to the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And in their data set, they showed that their vaccine does provide very, very good protection against severe disease, but not so good against mild moderate. What that means is that if you had one of these vaccines and you come into contact with a South Africa strain, that you could still catch the virus and have some mild symptoms, but you're very, very unlikely to become ill with it. Every time evidence comes out that one vaccine works very well, it reassures us that other vaccines are likely to behave in the same way, because vaccines essentially do the same thing. So at the moment, all the vaccines that we have are all very, very effective. They do provide very good protection, and I don't think people should worry about whichever one they've been offered.
Well, we've also had a few questions throughout the week from younger people who maybe feel that the virus affects them less. And we've got one question here from Rabia in Grangetown, who asks, if I have the vaccine, can I still spread it to others? Dr. Saul, what would you say to Rabia?
You can. You can't spread it from the vaccine, but the vaccine, although it protects you against the disease, we don't know how much it protects you about spreading the disease. Probably we think it reduces the risk of you spreading it by around about 50%, but we're still gathering the data on that.
Well, moving on from young people, there's also a Say N petition that expresses concerns that people with learning disabilities in care homes are maybe lower down on the priority list than they should be. I know neither of you can comment on the rollout policy, but Dr. Talabani, can I ask, are people with learning disabilities more at risk to this virus?
I think so. I think that's been proven in the data in terms of contraction of disease and then development of severe disease and the requirement for hospitalization. In fact, people with mental health problems as well also have demonstrated that. My understanding is that if you are in a care home, regardless of your age, you would have been offered the vaccine, but I could be mistaken on that.
Dr. Saul, do you think that those with learning disabilities should be higher on the priority list?
I totally agree with Binar. And actually, I think that they have actually been offered the vaccine. I know that we've got a care home in my practice area looking after people with learning disabilities, and they were one of the first places to be offered this. So I think it's work which is being undertaken right now because of the risk that we've heard about.
Well, if you are just joining us, we are live here at CGS News. We are asking Dr. Binar Talabani and Dr. Peter Saul your questions about COVID-19 vaccines. So please remember to send us all of your questions. Now, there's been a lot in the news over the last week about misinformation surrounding COVID vaccines, especially in Black and minority ethnic communities. Dr. Talabani, I know you've done a lot of work with Muslim Doctors Cymru to tackle some of this misinformation. How bad is the problem?
I think the problem is probably just as bad as it is if you're from a Caucasian background, but what's happening in these communities, and these are diverse communities with lots of, multiple languages, multiple faith, multiple cultures, is that you're receiving this misinformation, this inaccurate information in a language that perhaps you're more comfortable with if English is not your first language, but the accurate information isn't necessarily available in that same language, and that's something we're trying to tackle.
Yeah, you're talking about familiarity there. Do you think maybe it would help? I know the Welsh Government are considering giving out vaccines in mosques, for example. Do you think that would help?
I do. I think that would be a very good way to start engaging communities. I think there are other approaches that can also be taken. One, providing these information leaflets and videos and making them available in different languages is a very good way to tackle this problem. I think engaging faith leaders also carries real weight, actually, because if I say to my Muslim patient, for example, that they can have the vaccine, it carries a different weight than if their imam says it to them. The same applies to those of Hindu faith, Jewish faith, etc. So I think engaging community leaders and community figures will also go a long way to addressing these issues.
Well, we have had several questions from members of Black and minority ethnic communities. And we have one here from a viewer in Cardiff who says, I'm a Hindu and a vegan. Do COVID vaccines contain any animal products? What would you say to that viewer, Dr. Talabani?
No, so every single vaccine that has been approved in the UK is vegan.
Well, there's been lots of misinformation such as that regarding vaccines. And we even saw Vaughan Gething, the Welsh Health Secretary, address some of this misinformation in a press briefing last week. He addressed concerns circulating on social media that vaccines could affect fertility and even pregnancy. Dr. Talabani, do you know if there's any evidence to support these fears?
So I get asked this question a lot in these webinars that I've been doing. There is absolutely no evidence that infertility is a side effect of these vaccines or any vaccines. We've been vaccinating for many decades. We vaccinate millions of people each year, and infertility has never been a side effect of vaccinations. There's no reason, there's no biological or physiological reason why these vaccines should be any different. And with that confidence, lots of people of childbearing age within the NHS and care profession have had the vaccine, myself included. So no, I'm not worried about infertility. With regards to pregnancy, we don't include pregnant women in clinical trials, and that's just a traditional thing that we've always not done. However, the advice for pregnant women is if you are at high risk of contracting the virus, or if you are at risk of developing severe disease, so if you have other underlying health problems, such as, say, underlying asthma, then the vaccine will be offered to you. But it's not a case of you have to take it. We are saying go and speak to your doctors, go and assess your risk, the risk benefit, and then make a decision for yourself. We are offering it to breastfeeding women, and the evidence that we have so far that's emerging is that it's safe in both pregnancy and breastfeeding women. And in fact, newborns who are being breastfed are getting some of the antibodies, some of the protective elements that the vaccine helps our immune system to develop, to also provide them some protection. So I don't think it'll be long before we roll this out to pregnancy in general, but for now it's early data, and it's only if you are at risk of contracting the virus or having severe disease from it.
We have had a question in here from Caroline and Kay, who ask, will we need a booster vaccine in the autumn, or even a booster vaccine every year? Dr. Saul, what would you say to Caroline and Kay?
Yeah, I think Caroline and Kay, you're right in that assumption. I think there's two reasons we'll need a booster. One is that the immunity wanes, reduces as the time goes by. So we may need a booster from that point of view. But more to the point is that we'll probably need to be doing it in the same way that we give a flu vaccine every year, because the flu virus changes each year. And what we're seeing at the moment is the coronavirus is changing. We're developing, or different strains are being developed in different parts of the world. And what will happen is that we'll have an updated vaccine probably every year, possibly every 2 years, for a little bit of time to deal with these newer strains of the vaccine. So yeah, we're looking at that. It may well be that when people go for their flu vaccination this autumn, they'll be offered a booster COVID vaccine. It may be that we have to go a little bit before the flu season with the COVID. It's still one of these things that is being developed right now.
And could I also ask you, Dr. Saul, we've had a question in from Zola, who asks, how long will it be until we start to see an effect from these vaccines? So maybe when will rules start to lessen?
Well, I think we're probably seeing an effect right now. We're seeing a reduction in numbers of cases and hospitalizations. Now, much of that will be down to the lockdown that we've all been through in the last month or two, but some of it will be the introduction of vaccines. And as we get more people vaccinated, there will be a further improvement in transmission rates and in people falling ill with the condition. The question about when we're going to come out and get back to life as normal, things will improve, I think, within the next 4 weeks. My prediction, my slightly bad news prediction, is that I think we're not going to be getting back to normal this year. And I say that because there will still have to be a degree of precautions, of testing, of a degree of distancing. And remember that although the United Kingdom is going to be vaccinated by summertime, the rest of the world, it's probably not going to happen until the end of next year. And that's something that we need to think about. Until we're all vaccinated, nobody's safe, because these new strains can develop anywhere where the virus is prevalent.
Well, if I could ask my final question to you both. If you could sit down with someone who is skeptical or even against getting their COVID-19 vaccine, what would you say to them? Dr. Talabani, if I could ask you first.
I would say that these vaccines have been rigorously tested and really carefully analysed. They are safe, they are effective. And whereas normally we test new treatments and vaccines on 2,000 to 3,000 people before we make them available on the NHS, the 3 vaccines that are now approved in the UK have been collectively tested on 100,000 people. That's just in the clinical trials, not to mention the 13 million people who've actually already had the vaccine. So they are very much safe. And when you make your decision, please make your decision using accurate information and balance it against the risk that COVID has put on our lives in terms of, sadly, people dying, but also we're now seeing long COVID with irreversible organ damage. So that's the balance that you have to weigh up and make a decision based on accurate information.
And Dr. Saul, what would you say to anyone who is sceptical?
I think the first thing to do is to try and explore what's their worries and address those in the way that Binal's just said. But I'd also say that, you know, we all owe it to our families and to our communities to engage with this vaccine, because if we don't get sufficient uptake, and that's going to be over 80% of people, if we don't get enough uptake, then essentially it's not going to work.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this afternoon. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much to both of you for joining us, for giving up your time, and indeed a very informative live session. And thank you all at home for watching and submitting your questions throughout the session. Don't forget, you can follow us on all our social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at Broadcast CGS. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.